Welcome to Atomic Life. I'm Kurt Havens, and we're here again today with Nicholas Weir. How's it going, Nick?
Yeah, good. Yourself?
Good, man. So we were going to talk about human growth hormone today. Does that sound good?
Yeah, sounds good.
Why don't you start to unpack it, and we'll go through it.
All right. Well, basically, because I'm autistic as hell, I've got a dot point list here of pre-planned points to cover. Growth hormone, I mean, it's a peptide hormone. I think everybody knows that. They're well aware of that. It's released by the pituitary gland when it's produced endogenously in the body. And there's a few different versions, and it's primarily responsible for being like an antagonist to insulin in the sense that it liberates stored energy. So it liberates fatty acids from our like fat stores into the bloodstream to then be utilized as energy. And yeah, it's I don't want to say like a polar opposite of insulin, but it does act in a very kind of like mirrored fashion to insulin. And I mean, that's obviously a big reason why people will pair the two in a lot of cases, because there is a bit of synergy there. But yeah, it provides energy for IGF-1's functions, and yeah, which is produced downstream from growth hormone. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the history, I'm not too well versed on the history, but I know you are. So maybe you want to add a little bit about the history, Kurt?
Sure. Before I did the history, I was just going to say one of the things that's interesting about it is it's technically a stress hormone, right? But it's actually building tissue as well. So it's the only stress hormone that actually is responsible for building of tissue and not just breakdown. As far as the history is concerned, it's been studied for well over 100 years, closer to 120 years at this point, but it was not fully understood or identified until much more recently, probably like the 1940s, when they were able to extract it from pituitary glands accurately. And then in the 1970s, it became available as a pharmaceutical drug, as an actual extract. But it was really dangerous, and it caused something called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which by the time you were diagnosed with this disease, you were pretty much going to die. And then they subsequently pulled it off the market after that. And then it wasn't really available as a pharmaceutical drug until 1985, when they were able to actually synthesize it without using human pituitary glands.
So that would have been like the kind of the turn of the leaf that bodybuilders are really kind of looking for.
Yeah. So it wasn't really on the scene until after that. And you can kind of see that in bodybuilding, that like the mid to late 80s is when the Dorian Yates and those guys really came to be, right? It shifted from Lee Haney's original size to his later appearance. And then these guys after that were much larger. And it was between that and insulin usage mostly. And it was originally a 192 amino acid called MET-RGH. The current form is 191. So all human growth hormone that's on the market should be at 191. I speculate that some of the stuff that's on the black market might still be 192 because it's easier to manufacture, and it could be partly responsible for some of the responses that you see that are weird. Like I've seen localized like skin irritation and things like that, or immune responses. What's your take on that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I was going to say, like, yeah, I've heard like some clients will say reports of like getting like red rashes and stuff on their body, which is, yeah, like you said, very typical of an autoimmune response or some sort of allergic reaction. And yeah, it makes sense, because if there's like the 192 amino acid form as opposed to the 191, if it's not bioidentical, like the body is probably going to assume the worst. I recognize it as a foreign like pathogen and then attack it. And because it's different but still similar enough to endogenous growth hormone, only obviously differing by that one amino acid, it's enough to kind of cause the body to not only attack the exogenous but also your endogenous growth hormone, and then could potentially cause I suppose a deficiency, like a net deficiency in growth hormone within the body, and that could lead to a host of issues.
There's definitely, so it could also possibly be the kilodalton, right? So there's two basic forms that is produced by the pituitary. You have 20 kilodalton and you have 22 kilodalton. 22 kilodalton is the much larger percent. I think it's 95, 96% of all the growth hormone that's produced in the body is 22. The 20 kilodalton, no one's really sure exactly what that does. It obviously plays a role in something. It's possible that some of the black market stuff also might be that version and might not be as effective, right? We don't really know what it does. It could be, One of the reasons that it's possible to use something like MK677 concurrently with growth hormone would be to continue to produce the 20 kilodalton, because once you've now injected growth hormone, you will stop producing both. So
Yeah,
that could be a
that's
possibility
interesting.
for something like that. What do you know? What do you know about that? The 22, 20?
Well, yeah, I have heard, like, I don't know a lot, but I've heard what you just said of people pairing MK677 with the, like, just exogenous recombinant growth hormone for that purpose. But I mean, I've personally never done that. Um, and I mean, I could see a few negatives from that depending on the individual. Like, if someone's, I suppose, already struggling to not overshoot their calories, if they introduce MK677, like, could make ghrelin go through the roof and then cause them to just, like, eat ferociously. So I mean, I suppose, yeah, individual specific, it could be really useful. Like, they could serve a pretty, I suppose, useful practical application for it there. But yeah, I don't know a great deal about that, to be honest. I think, like you said, the autoimmune response or the allergic reaction to growth hormone could be down to either one of those factors, because they're the two differences. And as for, like, the role of 20 kilodalton growth hormone, I've had a bit of a, I suppose, a brainstorm of why we might produce it. And I thought maybe there might be something to do with, like, maybe the delivery of growth hormone to different areas of the body. That was my only thought, because I know, like, sex hormone binding globulin allows testosterone to reach different parts of the body that it otherwise wouldn't if it wasn't bound to
Correct.
SHBG. Not only acting as, like, it acts as a time release mechanism, so that way, like, we have a steady state of testosterone because we produce it on that, like, 24-hour diurnal rhythm. And to kind of, like, level out or smooth out the peaks and the troughs, we have SHBG to bind up some testosterone. So when testosterone starts dropping, you have that SHBG which unbinds from the testosterone. We have that kind of, like, steady state or somewhat steady state level of test. So I'm assuming maybe that has to do with, like, the two different kilodaltons of growth hormone. Maybe one form can bind better to certain locations of the body. I really don't know.
Okay.
That's just speculation.
It's interesting. I've never thought about that, but that's definitely a possibility. So similar to, you brought up sex hormone binding globulin. So growth hormone in humans, we have 7 IGF binding proteins. The seventh one is debatable. Some scientists claim that the seventh one technically isn't, but for the sake of this, we'll say there's 7. I think something interesting too is the way GH is typically tested in the blood is by the serum IGF. Right, that's the standard. I mean, there are tests for growth hormone specifically. What's interesting though is just like sex hormone binding globulin, the growth hormone and IGF are just IGF is carried on a binding globulin around the blood, and certain ones of those are to enable it to work, and others are to stop it from working. Right, and one of the interesting things about that is humans produce something called IGF binding protein 1, which animals do not. And this is where some of the confusion with estrogen as an anabolic comes from, is the trenbolone data on cattle. You and I've talked about this before. They show that when you administer estradiol concurrently with steroids, they grow more. Well, the problem is in humans, the higher up the estrogen goes, the higher the IGF binding protein 1 goes, which basically renders it useless. It'll still show its serum in the blood as an elevated IGF, although that IGF is useless. So I think that IGF testing is a valid method to test to see if your growth hormone is legitimate, it's dosed correctly. But I don't think it's a legitimate way to test to see if it's effective or not, right? I've seen serum levels that are elevated, but you get very little effect from it, right?
That might be a part of the reason why leaner individuals see a better growth response from growth hormone as well, because we spoke about this a little bit before, how we've had clients of ours, like, who are, say, higher in body fat, high levels of adiposity, say, oh, I don't really get anything, I'm not noticing anything out of growth hormone, and then we take it and, like, we notice a night and day difference. So if I stop taking it, like, I'd almost feel like it'd be the equivalent of, like, being a superhero losing their superpowers. It's like a very, very prominent difference, and that could have a lot to do with the, like you said, the estradiol being higher, maybe like high levels of body fat, higher aromatase production, or higher levels of aromatase enzyme, leading to more aromatization and then more suppression of that bioavailable IGF due to the IGF-1 binding protein being higher.
Yep. And so on a side note, binding protein 3, it actually enables growth IGF to work, right? So that's more like a sex hormone binding globulin where it's actually delivering it properly, whereas the 1 is basically rendering it useless. That can also be seen in females. So in human females, they have higher growth hormone levels than males, but their IGF is lower than ours because their binding protein 1 is more elevated from estrogen. So again, we should probably do a separate video on that subject altogether, but I think that that's kind of an issue that's confusing for a lot of people right now, because in the current trend in the market now is that everyone's driving their estrogen really high, thinking they're going to yield more growth. And I'm fairly convinced
thanks to one particular individual in the industry.
Yeah. So I'm not convinced that that's the right way. I would say we'll go into more depth with it in a different video, but I would say, assuming androgens are in the proper place and the androgen load is high enough, 40 to 80 would be the proper range for estradiol in a male. Anything really higher than 80, there's a huge drop off of results after that point. And that maybe that's what we're seeing in people that are naturally heavier. Like you said, maybe it's an aromatization issue and they're just producing more estrogen.
Yeah, which is leading to higher IGF-1 binding protein.
Yeah.
IGF binding protein 1. Yeah. Yeah,
and,
definitely.
Some of the other limiting factors too, like you said, I find growth hormone to be pretty groundbreaking, and I'm always amazed when people take it within reason and they claim they don't get a whole lot out of it, which I find really odd. So assuming that the growth hormone is real and legitimate, there's some other things too, right? Like thyroid function that can contribute to this, because also as someone gets heavier, right? You and I both notice that there seems to be a correlation between people that are leaner getting a better result out of growth hormone and people that are naturally a little heavier don't seem to see much. Do you want to go?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think that's where I suppose pairing growth hormone with exogenous T4 might be viable, like especially for those heavier individuals, because then they'll obviously have a higher conversion rate of T4 to T3 via the deiodinase enzyme too, and then that could solve that, like almost like as a patchwork solution to the low thyroid and then therefore not having the best response to growth hormone. But yeah, I've noticed that like leaner individuals, people with higher or faster metabolisms, people that I coach who have a higher maintenance caloric need, they tend to respond better to growth hormone. And then also they tend to get a bigger increase in energy expenditure too, like when they introduce growth hormone. Whereas the heavy individuals, I don't necessarily see that sudden drop in weight when you introduce growth hormone or drop in body fat. But with the leaner individuals who have a higher energy intake, I do notice like you add growth hormone in, and at a certain point, it's obviously individual specific, but you reach that kind of effective dose, highest effective dose, maximum effective dose, or whatever. And then as soon as you hit that, it's like the metabolism just turns up into overdrive. Yeah.
So with the maximum effective dose, something that I think is misunderstood, 1.7 units of HGH is considered a actual replacement dose in an adult male. That's about 220 pounds or 100 kilos. What we've noticed is that fat loss, though, continues past that point. So the hard science would say that fat loss should be capped at about 1.7, somewhere around 2 units for the average person. And then IGF production would just be the remaining of the effects if you were to take 6 units or 9 units or 18 units, whatever. But it's not the case. It's dose dependent. And the more that someone uses, the more fat loss they experience as well. A lot of that seems to be, so insulin as a hormone and IGF as a hormone are very similarly, they're related closely as far as size is concerned. And it seems that IGF can actually bind to the insulin receptor. So what looks like it's happening is if you were to take 6 units, even though you're past the supposed fat loss stage of growth hormone, that IGF will bind to the insulin receptor on fat cells and actually prevent fat from entering the cell. So you're almost getting similar to like the way yohimbine would work with blocking an alpha receptor. You're almost getting like reverse. You're just not allowing fat storage. So it'll still net as more fat loss.
Yeah. So I get what you're saying. So it's basically you're getting the liberation of fatty acids from the body fat stores into the bloodstream for energy from growth hormone. And then from that IGF-1 binding to the insulin receptor, you're getting that, it's almost like a reverse binding, so that it can't so you're basically inhibiting fat storage while liberating fatty acids, therefore you're going to like expedite fat loss. Yeah, that's interesting. So as dose goes up, it's almost like you're just turning the dial up on fat loss.
Yep. And
that's cool.
And there is no IGF receptor on fat cells. So that's how I arrived at that conclusion part of the way. So IGF itself cannot technically burn fat directly, but it's binding to the insulin receptor.
Makes sense why when people use Increlex, so they add it to their stack, that they see such an increase in fat loss, because that's just obviously twice as potent as using growth hormone.
Correct.
Relying on that
classically, you're not getting the classic GH like effect on fat loss that people are expecting, right? Because you're using something that in theory shouldn't be burning any fat. Yeah, and like I was mentioning earlier, so you see, at least in my experience, the more growth hormone someone uses, the more fat loss they will experience, right? Like a lot of guys never really go above the 2. Most guys in my experience probably hover somewhere around 2 and 3 units. That seems to be the common place. But the fat loss seems to be exponential the higher you go. If you go 6 units versus 9 units, right? Like the more you go, the leaner you get, the more muscle you build. Right. Like I know Chase has talked about 18 units, and the weight gain is fast and dramatic from a much larger dose than is a small dose.
Yeah. I think I noticed with most people that, I suppose, the real kind of turning point for noticing that real accelerated rate of fat loss is around that 8 to 10 IU a day mark. Like when people reach that, you just see something completely different start to occur and take place. But obviously that's expensive. Not a lot of people can run that. And a lot of people will talk, I suppose, crap on generics versus pharmaceutical, but I think you probably agree with me. If it's 191 amino acids, it's 191 amino acids. Yeah. A lot of it comes down to the handling process. How well is it handled? Is it stored in a shipping container, like a hot shipping container for several days before it arrives? Is it like thrown around heaps in transit? All those things obviously affect it. I mean, because you can get pharmaceutical growth that isn't handled well, that is going to be just as denatured as, I suppose, generics.
Yeah, I've seen more. I would say some of the worst denatured stuff I've seen are the pharmaceutical pens where they're mixed.
Yeah, already, because you see they're cloudy
in a shipping container for, like you said, for weeks.
Exactly. You're better off getting, because it's more stable in its unconstituted form. So you're better off getting it in that powder form because it's a lot more robust in the transit process and reconstituting it yourself. I mean, I've never used Serostim, but isn't Serostim unconstituted and you reconstitute it yourself?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and that's probably why people notice it's so much more effective. It's not to do with the brand. It's just to do with the actual, like,
with the handling, the way it's fresh, basically.
Yeah.
At least in the United States, that's something. So I'm not sure in Australia or in Thailand if there's even a supply of Serostim. There probably is not. So Serostim is the only one that's manufactured in the United States. It's made in Massachusetts. So when it's purchased here on the black market, it's generally very fresh, and it's not reconstituted. So you're getting a fresh powder versus a powder that was probably equal in quality, but it was made months ago or years ago in China. By the time it gets here on a boat, who knows what happened to it. Whereas same with the pens. The only difference I would say with Serostim is that it's 6 milligrams per vial. So it generally gets reconstituted with more water. So it's not where most, at least the black tops and things like that, are generally like 1 ml of water gets mixed. Serostim usually gets 1.8 ml. Because when you reconstitute growth hormone, the standard is you want 3 IU should equal 1 milligram. And in order to keep that formula the same, so you can keep the dosing, equal amongst brands, so Serostim is technically higher milligram dose, but I don't think there's necessarily anything higher quality about it, except that it's fresh and it wasn't sitting on a shipping container.
And let's be honest, most people don't do their math very well when they're reconstituting their growth hormone stuff. So it's possible people think it's more potent too, because they're actually completely missing the point that, like you said, it's higher in concentration. So therefore they might think they're taking, say, 2 IUs, but they're actually taking 3.6 or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So I've met people that thought they were using 2 units of Serostim, but they were only reconstituting with 1 ml. So then the milligram dose is way higher than it would be with another source. So it's not that it's any better. It's just that it's, the concentration is different. So I think at least from my experience with people, the limiting factor on someone's dose, beside obviously there's financial reasons. Growth hormone is not cheap. It is cheaper now than it was in the 90s. You know, in the Ronnie Coleman days, growth hormone was extremely expensive. It is not, I don't really find it to be super expensive now. If someone is price sensitive, obviously it's going to cost more than say a bottle of testosterone. What I find to be the limiting factor is the side effects, which generally for most guys that are healthy, it seems to be numbness in the hands.
Yeah.
Right. You probably find the same thing. There's
Wake
a
up
dose
with
that
a
we all
numb.
get to that you really can't go above because you basically can't feel anything at a certain point.
Exactly, yeah. And I mean, that's like you said, that's the limiting factor. Aside from financial considerations, like, yeah, the only other limiter is when do you experience side effects and to what degree? Because I mean, I think we'd argue that the trade-off with this is you got to weigh up the pros and the cons. There's a lot of pros with growth hormone, and maybe you're starting to experience one con, like you said, bit of tingling and numbness. But if you're doing it for the muscle growth, then you might endure that side effect. But when it comes to the other ones, like, I mean, you've got the tingling and like carpal tunnel syndrome and stuff like that. You've also got water retention, insulin resistance that can potentially come about from it. So when those things start coming into play, like say water retention causing blood pressure to go up, if you're not managing that, that could be very deleterious to like your kidney function, kidney health. And once you screw your kidneys up, that's it. So I mean, yeah, like you said, you got to find that sweet spot. What's your maximum tolerable dose? And that could change. Like it's a floating target, like similar to anabolics. Like when you first start, you might see higher rates of aromatization. Then as your body upregulates androgen receptor production, you have a higher AR density. You can basically utilize higher doses better. Therefore, you get less aromatization, and you can handle higher doses. So you get less side effects at higher doses. And I think growth hormone is similar. People find that they can slowly escalate the dose as they get larger because they have more total tissue to basically utilize that compound. It's a big reason why I hate young guys or guys who are new to the enhanced world, just thinking that more is better. It's really not. It's just more a lot of the time is just more side effects for most people until they build that, like you kind of said, foundation. Would you agree that you can combine growth hormone with things like insulin and diuretics and ARBs to manage the side effects and get like a better response out of it, basically be able
Oh,
to escalate the
absolutely.
dose? Yeah, I think
I
that's
mean,
where the polypharmacy comes into it. And it's really important that you understand what you're doing. I suppose that's where it's very individual specific, and why you and I can't give, I suppose, specific recommendations and advice on this. It's like if you want that, you kind of have to hire somebody as a coach because there is such an individual response.
yeah, I typically avoid the insulin conversations, you know, with a client or someone because it's so individual and it can be dangerous if not used correctly. So it definitely is synergistic with growth hormone, but as a general thing, I generally don't go into the insulin thing on the internet because I think it's misused. And I think a lot of guys that assume that they need insulin probably don't need insulin, right? Like if you assume that you're advanced, you're probably not advanced, right?
Exactly.
Advanced
Yeah.
guys know they're advanced and they don't need to talk about it generally. I would say the recommendation I would make for growth hormone is generally if it's your first time out, you would start low, right? You'd start at 2 units and you slowly titrate up over a period of time. And then if you run into a side effect, I think then you would titrate back down by 25% and hold there and see what occurs. And then you can move back up. But like you said, it could take time. Very few individuals are running, 10 units, 12 units, 18 units out of the gate. That's to me a really rare thing. I think most guys can get by initially somewhere between 2 and 5. And I found that it seems like more of the anabolism, we could probably get into that too. The anabolism from it seems to be around 5 or above. Really, there's not a whole lot of growth that occurs under 5.
Mm.
The anabolic thing on its own is kind of a unique thing because it's not growth hormone in and of itself is not causing muscle growth per se, right? Like I have a whole chapter in my book about that. So we don't need to go into a ton of depth there, but I don't think used on its own, it's not going to just be a groundbreaking thing as far as muscle growth is concerned. I think concurrently with a stack with testosterone and nandrolone or something similar to that, it would cause some level of hyperplasia and magnify the effects of the steroids, but I don't think on its own it's not really been shown to do much.
Especially with nandrolone or tren, I think, because of the progestogenic nature of it, and like we kind of spoke about earlier, or you did, how the misconception of estrogen being higher and increasing the overall IGF-1. When it comes to humans, progesterone is anabolic, whereas estrogen isn't. So tren and nandrolone being progestogenic in nature, elevating progesterone levels, we have that in the presence of more growth hormone, IGF-1, we're going to see more anabolism. So, I mean, I think, definitely when, like you said, paired concurrently with anabolics that are a 19-nor derivative, we're going to see that synergy, I guess, to a higher degree. And the anabolism. And would you agree that like splitting your GH dose up throughout the day could potentially enhance the anabolic effects? Like more systemic, more localized growth instead of systemic?
Yeah. So it's used, I mean, there's a million ways to use it. There are some guys spot inject, right? Some guys split up doses. I think the standard way is to split. The standard way I'd recommend is that the doses are split, right? In, 3 units, give or take per dose every couple hours. It takes about 6 hours without insulin for the GH receptor to become, active again. So you wouldn't
Then
use it like
3
you
to
wouldn't
4 with
every
insulin.
hour. What's up?
And then 3 to 4 with insulin, would you say?
Yeah, give or take. Yeah, about depending on the person, and probably depending on the insulin. So certain people do better with a large dose at night. If a large bolus dose were to be used, like if you were going to use a whole bottle of Serostim, it typically wouldn't be done during the day because it would make you very tired, right? So you would use, the guys that are going to use a large amount might use just a gigantic bolus dose right before bed, assuming that it's not disruptive to sleep or cause side effects. In children with delayed growth, what we've seen is that if you're going to dose it at night, it actually has better blood sugar outcomes than during the day. And if they experience side effects, if the dose is then done every other day. So instead of lowering the dose, so if a child is given 6 milligrams or 18 units of Serostim for growth and they experience side effects, the dose isn't lowered, the frequency is lowered. So
That makes
mimic
sense.
more than natural.
Well, because when you think about it, it's not the IGF-1 that's affecting blood sugar, it's the growth, and that's only really active for the first few hours. Then you get the IGF-1, which is active for like over a day.
8
So, I
days.
mean,
Yeah, 8 days.
8 days.
days,
Yeah. Apologies. Yeah, and so that makes sense. So infrequent dosing schedule would cause like just less overall, I suppose, suppression of blood sugar from that liberation of stored energy from the growth. Yeah, that's cool.
And I think the old method of using the 5 on 2 off, that seems to be a common thing in bodybuilding. That's actually not based in any science. That was based on price and availability. So bodybuilders a long time ago used to inject growth hormone like Monday through Friday, and then they'd take the weekends off, and then it started again on Monday. And that kind of became a thing. And that literally was just because of supply and cost, because it became near impossible to afford growth hormone 7 days a week. There's no actual benefit of skipping those 2 days in a week. You'd be better off either using every day or every other day. Those are the only 2 ways it's ever studied.
I was going to say, I remember Dorian Yates. I don't believe I recall who he was talking to, but he said something about he only ever used 8 IUs or whatever. Probably lied about the dose, but he only used every other day. And he said that it was a game changer when he did that. So it was probably honestly the better insulin sensitivity caused from that infrequent dosing. If he was doing that like infrequently and having that IGF-1 elevated around the clock, but just obviously not having growth hormone elevated as often or as long.
Yep. Yeah. And also, again, with someone like Dorian Yates, you have a huge genetic response variability. So Dorian, and a lot of people don't want to hear this. And again, I'll just take what he says at face value and believe what he says. But a lot of the guys that are hyper responders like that don't need as much as people that are not hyper responders, right? I know a lot of guys that are very large that use very small amounts of things. I also know some that use large amounts of things, but that's not as common. I find lots of average size guys in gyms tend to use more gear, more growth hormone, more things like that than a lot of these guys that are mass monsters. And that's kind of the difference, is that genetic thing. So Dorian might have 8 units in him might have been like 20 units in a normal person.
Yeah.
Assuming that he's telling the truth, but I have no reason to I don't, you know, I know people that have trained with him, and this is the same story I get from them as well. So I have no reason to not believe him. So for individual goals, I guess, do you want to talk about like if you have like a lifestyle client that you just want to look better, feel better, or you know, anti-aging stuff versus someone maybe a
Mhm.
little bit of fat loss, and then you want to talk about like a bodybuilder, someone wants to be an open bodybuilder, what the standard differences would be?
Yeah, yeah. Like we could put like maybe say rough reference ranges for
Yeah.
daily dosages. Okay, yeah. So like just general well-being, improved quality of life, 0 to 2 IUs a day, I'd say that that'd be satisfactory for most people. So yeah, if you have a bad response, maybe 3 IUs a day split into two 1.5 IU doses, I'd reckon. And then beyond that, for athletic applications, better recovery, enhanced recovery, that sort of thing, maybe up to 4 IUs a day. And I think bodybuilder like 5 to 10, anywhere in that range. And beyond that point, just if you've got the money, and you don't get any side effects, you're just going to see a bigger return if you just escalate that dose, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen doses as high as 30. In my book, I discuss the maximum dose. It seems that 28 units seems to be the maximum that any human's going to be able to use. So they're not too far off with the 30. That to me would be very rare, right? The cost and the risk of side effects, I think, would be really great for someone. The biggest guys that I know that tend to use more probably are somewhere between, like you said, 10 to 12, maybe 15. Like I only know one
Mm.
guy personally that's using 18 units. Seems to be a rare thing with doses that big. Okay, so to kind of summarize what Nick and I talked about, so growth hormone both acts through itself as growth hormone, and a lot of the effects are done through IGF. As far as dosing is concerned, it seems anywhere between 1 unit, perhaps for a smaller female or a health conscious person, all the way up to 28 on the very, very top end. Normally, doses are split in smaller doses every 6 hours or twice a day. Seems to be a more efficient way to use it so you don't get a dropout. There are people that use one big bolus dose, which would typically be done at night. One of the misconceptions you see out there that's perpetuated in the bodybuilding community is the timing, also then time with fasted cardio. So the absorption rate for growth hormone dubs done subcutaneously is 3 to 4 hours. So if someone is injecting growth hormone first thing in the morning and then going for a walk, the growth hormone is not even in their system yet. So that seems a little silly to me. And something, if you look at the pharmaceutical instructions on any of the brands, it doesn't ever say to use in a fasted state. So it's pretty irrelevant. Once you introduce an exogenous amount of any of these hormones, you're bypassing a lot of these natural feedback mechanisms. Like, you know, it comes from our natural insulin levels will suppress growth hormone. But when you're injecting growth hormone, you're not necessarily going to get the same effect there. So the timing, I tell people the easiest way to use it is whatever is going to fit into your life and you'll do consistently, not so much worry about it has to be in the morning, it has to be now, it has to be post-workout, pre-workout. Those things are relatively irrelevant. Like we talked about before, you know, growth hormone is relatively transient in the blood, but IGF is elevated for 8 days post-injection. So it doesn't really matter when it's used. It seems that so GH on its own for fat burning seems to be somewhere around 2 units, seems to be the most efficient just from the growth hormone point of view. As far as fat loss from IGF, again, we talked about earlier, it's not direct, but the fat loss from IGF seems to be dose dependent. The more that's used, the more fat loss is going to occur up to a point. Same with muscle building. I would say the more someone can use, the more they can tolerate, the more they can afford, the larger they would grow from it, assuming they're using other steroids. Side effects typically are just numbness in limbs. What is considered carpal tunnel syndrome, it's not necessarily the growing of the straps in the wrist. It's more of a sodium and water retention issue that's pushing on the nerve, the medial nerve. And in certain individuals that are prone to it, blood sugar can get elevated. I know commonly in labs, what you'll see is if someone's on growth hormone for a long period of time, is you'll notice their A1C will be elevated, but their fasting should still be low. If the fasting glucose is elevated, that becomes an issue. You will see A1C elevated because the long-term effect is that glucose is a little bit higher from the constant growth hormone levels. But outside of that, it's really the most common thing is the numbness in the hands is really what you see. I don't typically see a lot of other strange occurrences with growth hormone. I think that's pretty much it. Do you have anything else to add to
No,
that?
not really. That was a good summary. Yeah, I was just going to say I completely skimmed over and forgot about the whole point of growth hormone for like fasted cardio purposes being ideal to take it a few hours prior to cardio if you are going to do it for that reason. Yeah, that's a good point.
Right. I think people obsess
Yeah,
about the timing of it for some reason, and it's not. It would be like looking at the timing of a long ester testosterone. It doesn't matter, right? It's
yeah,
not like suspension where it's very acute. It's a long term thing. So I think
yeah,
the other thing that's interesting is growth hormone is typically considered like a longer term investment, right? Like most people should be using it for an extended period of time, if not indefinitely within medical sanity. I think the bigger the dose, though, the faster the results are from it, right? Like I think sometimes people will say things like, "Oh, you won't see much for 6 months." I don't really find that to be the case in people. I find that the bigger the dose, they tend to experience results very quickly. If someone were to only use 2 units, it might take 6 months, depending on the person, to actually see something, especially if they tend to be heavier.
exactly. Yeah, and I mean yeah, I can definitely 100% agree with you on that point because I spent a 2 week period, a 2 week stint where I was at a very hefty dose because I didn't want to waste it before I flew out of the country. And I saw exponential results in that 2 week time frame, like a night and day difference. Although I couldn't afford to run that dose for an extended period of time because it would send me broke. But it was a fun little experiment, and it completely transformed my physique. And I'm not saying this to encourage the use of growth hormone or I suppose I should say the abuse and the high doses, but you are 100% right in that the dose has an impact on the rate of results. Escalate the dose, rate of results is shortened or condensed. Like,
Yep.
yeah,
And I would say for more specific stuff, if people have more specific questions, they can either reach out to you as a coach or me as a coach. I've also written a book on growth hormone that I'll put in my link tree below. But yeah, I mean, I think this is probably in depth enough for video
definitely.
outside of some
Yeah,
deeper science. Cool, Nick. Well, thank you again for coming. We'll see you next week.
yeah. Thank you.